I get a lot of questions about finishes, usually about things that have gone wrong, and it usually comes down to the sanding. Sanding is probably one of the most important parts to furniture building. If you're not going to put the time into the sanding, you might as well not even build it. And there's a couple rules of thumb that I kind of live by. Number one, try to avoid using stain. Stain is going to highlight any imperfections in the wood, and it's also going to highlight any imperfections in your sanding. So that's like scratches and swirls and things like that. So if you want a piece of furniture that's kind of brown, use walnut. If you want kind of a reddish brown, use cherry. If you want kind of a honey color, use white oak. This is hickory, not hickory, this is chestnut. First time I've ever used this is actually reclaimed wood. And I'll throw a coat of finish on this at the end of the video so you can see what it looks like. But anyway, my process for sanding is number one, sand as you go. So when things are square, they're a lot easier to sand because you can do some of the heavy lifting with a drum sander if you have a drum sander. You can also use an orbital sander or a palm sander. So often when I'm ripping parts to size on the table saw, like these braces here, I'm going to be ripping them, and anytime you're ripping material on the table saw, you're going to end up with small blade marks. And so I'll usually rip the material just a little bit heavy and then run it through the drum sander and remove those blade marks. I almost always use 100 or 120 grit sandpaper in the drum sander. It just has one drum on it, and you take a very little bit off as you go. And when I use the drum sander, I usually start it heavier or higher than it actually needs to be. So I'll start running the piece through, and then I'll lower the drum until it just skims that first part, and then I'll continue to run it through, lowering it a little bit as I go. So that's the main thing. Try to figure out what you can use the machines for and do that. So in this case, it was the tops, or not the tops, but the top, the legs, the apron, these braces. Then you have to start thinking about what you're going to use a small machine for, so like an orbital sander like this. For this, I almost always just use 80 grit sandpaper. This does a good amount, or removes a good amount of material, and it gets the job done. But it will leave some swirls, so you don't want to go too crazy with it. Definitely keep it moving. The other sander that I use is this little palm sander. This is a Milwaukee. My favorite palm sander is the Porta-Cable. It's got kind of the hourglass shape. I haven't been able to find one of those. I probably could just order one online, but that one is a little bit more expensive. I think this one was maybe 60 bucks. The one I'm talking about, the Porta-Cable, is probably 100, maybe 120. But that one just has a nicer feel to it, and I think it does a better job. So I'll pick up one of those at some point. As far as the paper that I use in this palm sander, I will start with 120, then move to 180, and then do any finish sanding with 220. There's absolutely no reason to sand the wood more than 220 or go any lower than 220. Often I'll hear people talking about 320, 600. I don't know. I just don't think it's necessary. This has been sanded down to 180. I'll give it a quick hit with 120, and then it will be ready for finish. As far as sanding in between finishes, then I use 320. Another thing to think about is softening the edge, but not rounding it over. Softening the edge is basically taking that sharpness away. I do that because the sharpness is more susceptible to damage, and it also has kind of a sharp feel and doesn't look at or feel as nice as far as I'm concerned. What you don't want to do often is round over. When you see things like this edge here, if this was rounded over, it starts to take on kind of a high school shop looking project. So I don't round over with the machine because the machine can get out of control. So what I like to do is with the lighter sandpaper, like the 180 or the 220, that's when I start to cut my corners. I'm not going to cut the corner with 80 grit. I'm not going to cut the corner with this. I'm going to use my hand and just kind of take that sharpness off, because I want the lines of the piece of furniture. Another suggestion is try to do most of your sanding before the piece is put together. So this whole piece, every part of this piece was sanded to probably 120, some areas 180, areas that I thought would be hard to get to. So that sanding is done, and then after the final glue up, I'm a big fan of removing any glue squeeze out with a wet rag, sometimes a wet paintbrush. Other woodworkers disagree with that. They will say that the wood glue residue gets into the grain. I've never had that problem. I do a very good job of getting rid of any of the glue residue, and I just think it's a lot easier getting rid of glue residue with a wet rag or a wet paintbrush, and instead of trying to scrape it off after the fact. Keep in mind though, that wet rag or water will raise the grain, so it's going to have to be sanded again. So this whole piece was assembled, you know, the glue up was done, and I finished that yesterday, and I've already spent about 2 hours giving this piece the final sanding. Just making sure I've gone over every little bit to make the piece smooth, to have it all sanded consistently down to 220, and now it's ready for finish. So that's how I sand everything I do. I've been doing this a while and it works out well. Like I said, there's no reason to go beyond 220 in my book. So generally I've got the 120, 180, 220 spray. So that's it for now, guys. Unless you want to hang on and see what this piece or this wood looks like after it gets a coat of lacquer. And then this build will be coming up soon. This reclaimed chestnut table I'm building is my next Maker's Mob project. If you'd like to learn how to make furniture for your home, I hope that you'll click on the link in the description to my Maker's Mob and learn more about my step-by-step furniture making tutorials. And while you're there, download some free plans that I hope will inspire your next woodworking project.